A man spent 30 years binding, torturing, and killing 10 people. Then he stopped. Not because he was caught, not because he moved. He stopped because he wanted to see if anyone was still looking for him. And when he decided to find out, he handed investigators the one piece of evidence they needed to end it. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Dennis Rader surrendered himself. Not to guilt, not to exhaustion, but to something far colder. And the answer involves a psychological trait that the FBI had documented in his profile years before they knew his name. On January 15, 1974, the Otero family was found dead in their home in Wichita, Kansas. Joseph and Julie Otero, their son Joey, 11 years old, their daughter Josephine, 9. A fifth family member had left for school that morning and survived only because of timing. The killer had been inside the house, waiting. The murders were methodical, controlled. There was no sign of forced entry. The telephone line had been cut before entry. The offender had brought his own rope. Over the following years, 4 more victims were killed in Wichita. And then the killer did something unusual. He wrote letters to police and local media, describing the crimes in clinical detail and demanding a name be given to him. He suggested it himself: BTK, bind, torture, kill. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't confessing. He was managing his own narrative. This is the part nobody talks about openly in the case files. According to accounts from FBI behavioral analysts, including details discussed in John Douglas's book Mindhunter, investigators developed a profile suggesting the offender was organized, likely held a position of authority or control, was embedded in the local community, and was driven by a strong need for recognition. A distinction analysts drew between seeking fear and seeking significance. Not infamy. Recognition. There is a difference. Infamy is about fear. Recognition is about significance. BTK's last confirmed murder occurred in 1991. Communications to police and media also ceased around that period. For over a decade, there was silence. Then in 2004, letters began arriving again at local media. The killer was back in contact. Reporting at the time, including coverage by the Wichita Eagle, suggested that Rader resumed contact after a local newspaper published an article implying the BTK case might never be solved. A theory consistent with the psychological profile investigators had developed, and one Rader himself has not publicly disputed. Remember what was said at the start: he handed investigators the evidence they needed. Here is exactly how that happened. In February 2005, BTK sent a floppy disk to a local television station. The disk contained a document. Metadata embedded in that document carried the name of the last person to edit it: Dennis. It was linked to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Within days, investigators had Dennis Rader's name. Rader was 60 years old. He had served as president of his church congregation. He had worked as a compliance officer enforcing local ordinances, a position that gave him legal authority to enter properties and confront residents. He had a family, a church congregation he led, and a reputation in his community as a rigid and demanding presence, the kind of person neighbors remembered, but not the kind anyone suspected. He was arrested on February 25, 2005, during a traffic stop. He offered no resistance. At his sentencing, Rader described his crimes in a detached, procedural tone, correcting investigators on specific details, offering unsolicited clarifications. The courtroom was largely silent, not from horror, but from something harder to name. He received 10 consecutive life sentences. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his crimes. Rader is currently incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility. He has continued to communicate with researchers and journalists. In documented interviews and public statements, Rader has not expressed remorse in terms that observers, including researchers and journalists who have studied the case, have described as genuine or credible. The floppy disk. That's the answer to the opening question. He sent it because a man who had evaded law enforcement for 30 years, a man intelligent enough to leave almost nothing behind at 10 crime scenes, chose to take a risk that cost him everything. Not from carelessness, at least not in any ordinary sense. The most widely accepted interpretation, consistent with the behavioral profile developed years earlier, is that the decision was driven by the same psychological need investigators had documented long before they knew his name: the need to be recognized. The profile was right. It just couldn't tell them where to look. What investigators still debate is this: if the newspaper had never published that article suggesting the case was going cold, would Rader have stayed silent forever? And if so, how many others are doing exactly that right now?